Hello, Abnormal Investigations. I'm still fighting the cold just a little bit, but I've been looking into this encounter here, and man, it's a crazy one. It was brought to my attention by Dana, and Dana had asked me to look into this encounter, so I told her I would look into it. So, this encounter is one that comes out of London, Ohio. Okay, so there was some people in London, Ohio by the name of Diane and Keith Williams. Now, this werewolf encounter that some people do call a werewolf encounter is not what he called it, okay? And Keith made it clear in an interview that he done that he did not call it a werewolf. In fact, he did not believe someone could change from a person to a werewolf. So, was this a werewolf? I don't know. We will look into that when we reach the end of this encounter. This one is pretty cool, has a lot of twists, and I did find some things I noticed was not in the mainstream story of this. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to try to take you guys beyond the story, beyond the what sells the story, because every story has a reason, a motive, a beginning, and it may not always be the climax of the story, right? But I think it's just as important to understand what caused the chain of events or parts of that story to happen. I think they are just as important as the climax of the story, because I want to know everything that went on, because sometimes little things can be big things and big things can be little things. And you can't have a complete idea or theory on a subject unless you have the full and complete information of what happened. So, in this one here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the mainstream, pretty much the story that was put out by most everybody. Like I said, most of these encounters are all put out by the same people. They have the same story, pretty much same everything. I'm trying to dig further than that, but let's start out with the mainstream. Okay, so here we go. Diane had found this lovely little house in the woods, and her family moved in. One night, Diane started hearing little scampering noises outside of her house. When she didn't see anything through the window, she dismissed it as just a stray dog or a deer from the woods. Still, something didn't feel right to her. When she looked again, she saw eyes. But these eyes that were looking at her were at human level through the window. She noticed that whenever she would change rooms, that these eyes would also change rooms, and they would all still be at eye level while watching her. Her husband Keith was away at the time. He was attending school, trying to further his education. And whenever Keith returned home that night, which he wasn't gone long after she had had that encounter, he found her in the home, terrified. So Keith grabbed the flashlight and he went outside to investigate to see who or what was in the yard. Now, after a week or two later, Diane was doing dishes and she saw the eyes again. This time, they were dangerously close to the window. She backed away slowly into another room, and the eyes followed her once again. Diane was so afraid that she began turning off the lights in the house, thinking that if she'd done this, it would not be able to see her, but she would have the advantage of being able to see it. So she done this while moving into the front room, shutting off the lights, closing the blinds. As she was doing that, Diane noticed what she thought was a person standing by the window, peering through the window at her. So, Diane sat in the dark waiting for her husband to return home. She could hear the person outside, in the front of the house, moving from the front to the back. Diane became afraid, so what she done then? She called the police. Now, this story that you're getting from the mainframe is not going to be as deep as what we're fixing to go into. She calls the police. The story is the police arrive, they find nothing, and they blame it on her being afraid, pretty much. In the country, home alone, being a female. So, approximately 4 months later, shortly after the first snow, Keith woke up early and he decided to go get donuts for everyone. He started the car and he rubbed his eyes. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he noticed that there was eyes there. He grabbed the flashlight again out of the vehicle, jumped out, and started searching. He froze at the side of the tracks in the snow. He noticed the tracks went up to the house and then across the top of the house, across the roof. Something was there. Keith called his friend Dennis, asking him to come over and to bring his gun. Weapons in tow, Keith and Dennis began following the creature's tracks into the snow. This creature was huge, and it had a powerful jump. It definitely was not human. You're going to find out here in a second how much is really left out of these stories when this happens. Now, they tracked the creature for miles. Well after the sun had came up, they reached a clearing, and at the clearing was a small cabin. The tracks led right to the back door. Dennis began banging on the walls, yelling for the creature or person to come out. Realizing how their situation appeared, two guys standing outside the cabin with the guns, yelling for someone to come out, they decided probably wasn't a good idea since it wasn't their property, and you're beating on somebody's house saying, come out. Probably not a good idea because they may feel, afraid and decide to defend themselves, right? So Keith ended up calling his dad, asking him to come and pick him up. When they explained to Keith's dad what they were doing out there, Keith's dad thought he knew who lived in the cabin. He said it was an old man that worked at the tire shop. A few weeks later, as Diane was doing dishes, she saw the eyes again. This time, they were dangerously close to the window. She backed away slowly. She was afraid. The eyes followed her once again from window to window. Diane began turning off the lights as she had done before. Afraid and in terror, this would happen several times, as Diane would blame it on prowlers. So, whenever you're told it's prowlers by your husband, a lot of women will try to attribute that to, thinking that they know what they're talking about. So, Dennis's dad ended up telling him, he said, I think I know who lived in that cabin of those tracks you followed it to. So, Keith ends up telling Dennis, hey, let's go. So they take an old tire that they have to the tire shop, hoping to get, a good look at this guy that works at the tire shop that supposedly lives in this house. So Dennis showed up the next week with an old tire to be fixed. They would at least get a good look at the man. When the manager of the tire shop called the man George, they now had the man's name. George came out of the shadows to get the tire. And when he locked eyes with Keith and Dennis, they knew that it had to be George. His eyes were intense, and they had a gold shine to them. The tire went into the darkness as George repaired it. And then the tire rolled back out of the darkness into the light over to Keith and Dennis. What was weird is when they looked at the tire, there was markings on it, almost the kind of markings you would see in ancient times. Keith hesitated to tell Diane about what was happening, so he just suggested to her when he wasn't home that she should probably have her sister come over and visit. So, about 3 months later, Dennis called Keith and said they were going for a ride. So they drove out near George's cabin again. Dennis informed him that George had died. They found a deputy sheriff that they knew who took them to the cabin. You're going to find that I found a lot more into this than what they're telling in this story. You guys have got to see this, the deputy sheriff said. Inside the cabin, they smelled what smelled like a wet dog. There were no personal items, no food, nothing that would even look like someone would live there. But the deputy showed them another room. Behind a door, they found a room with the walls covered in plate steel, held together by riveted metal. Inside were heavy restraint chains attached to the steel walls. The walls were covered in scratches. Everyone was thinking werewolf, but no one really wanted to say it because, hey, they're not supposed to exist, right? So it goes on to say that after George passed away on the outcome, that was pretty much the end of the story. George passes away. George is buried in an unmarked grave where they bury people that don't have insurance or anything like that. So pretty much end of the story, right? No. So I started looking further into this story, and I found some things I thought were pretty interesting when you really break the story down. So let's break the story down and take it a little bit further. So in the story, what they failed to notice, what they failed to tell everybody is Keith and Diane. They also had a daughter that was 4 years old named Raven. And that's going to be really important later on with what I found extra with this, because Keith really wasn't concerned about leaving his wife and daughter at this home because this was a really safe area. This wasn't a place that was in a bad place. This was supposed to be a safe community. And there was other log cabins around the area. So it wasn't really somewhere that he was afraid to leave them at night by themselves. That's going to be very important here in a minute, though, as they had a 4-year-old daughter named Raven. One night while Keith was away, Diane heard scampering noises outside by the window, okay? She couldn't see it. She assumed it was a dog or a deer. The second time, she did see the eyes outside of the window and assumed again that it was a deer or a dog. But then she noticed that they were eye level and that they were watching her. That's going to be really important also because there's a lot being left out that we're going to get into. Diane panicked and closed all the curtains. Keith returned soon after and found Diane in a state of terror. She told Keith what had happened, and he grabbed the flashlight, went outside, and looked around. He didn't see any signs of tracks or anything that night. Keith did grow up as a hunter and a tracker, though. He let her know that everything was okay. Even against his better judgment, he told her everything was fine. Even though he felt like it may not be fine, he didn't want her to think it was fine, which I don't think we should do that. I don't think we should tell people it's okay if it's not, just to calm their nerves. I think there's a way to calm people and still be truthful. So 1 month later, Diane has another encounter, and the eyes are now at the window, but this time they're closer to the window. It's not as far away from the window. She now knows that what she is looking at is not a reflection. It's not a human. She backs away from the window into the front room to avoid the eyes. She's now upset because she knows that she just saw something. You're going to know why here in a minute, what she actually saw that's not told in this part of the story. But she saw something that would change her life for the rest of her life. You know, the Cherokees say that you should not look out the windows at night, and this would be a prime example of that. Diane turned off the lights in the house to get the upper hand. This way she could see it, and she could tell it could not see her. She then noticed it was now at the front room window, following her again, but this time she says something I thought was pretty interesting. She says, I could tell that it wasn't a spirit, but it was a physical creature. That really caught my attention. She said it looked like a man, and she was certain that it was, and she called 911. She's having trouble trying to understand what she has just seen because your mind is going to fight with you. It's going to say, this is not supposed to exist. And you're going to try to rationalize what you just saw. It looked like a man. And she was certain that it was, so she called 911. The officers arrived and searched the yard. Keith shows up with a flashlight also as he finds the officers searching his yard. They all searched and found nothing. Keith says that he was embarrassed because he was afraid that his wife was overreacting, been in the country alone, and now the law's involved, and it's embarrassing. So he's trying to play it off as she's just afraid, I'll take care of it, blah, 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 right? So when Keith noticed the footprints on the roof of their home and then saw how far it had jumped off of the house, they estimated that would be the equivalent of a 35 to a 40-foot fall. It would be more than a human could take on an impact, and plus get up and still run away. The tracks they found were 14 inches long with claws at the end. Kind of remind me of the Palmyra Maine werewolves. Remember that? They had the claw hooks at the end. Well, they have the same thing in this story too, so that may be something we need to start looking into is the claw hooks. Now, Keith did state that when they seen George at the shop, he looked at them in almost a supernatural look. And they said that they were almost in a trance when they looked at him because his eyes seemed to pull them in. They were almost like mesmerized by his eyes. Now, George knew who they were when they saw him, but they also recognized George. It was one of those, I know, you know, but they wasn't saying anything. Now, they did go to George's cabin to confirm that he had passed away. They're leaving some of the story out right here also. When they arrived, there was a deputy there and said, I have to show you something. Now, what they thought was really strange again inside of the house is there was no furniture in the cabin. The deputy opened the door to another room. It smelled like the wet dog. The walls were covered in iron plates, riveted together by steel. There was no lights in the room. The room did not have any windows, and there was shackles on the ends of two 10-foot chains that were attached to the wall. And there was scratches all over the wall. They left out some of this too that I found I think is going to be very important. The deputy looked at him and said, I wonder what he kept in here, and kind of laughed it off. So when I listened to the story, I got to thinking, and I thought there's got to be a lot more to this because it just seemed to me like there was things missing. Things were not adding up completely. I mean, yeah, it was a good werewolf story, and you know, you got the eyes at the window, you got the wife seeing it, she hears stuff outside, the husband's gone. You have a werewolf story that's a good story. But when I really dove into it, and you look at the actual interview that Keith had on several different platforms in his interviews, which was never placed into the story, which I don't understand why they didn't do that, because I'm noticing on more and more of these videos, people are more interested in the entertainment of the story than they are the facts. And I'm trying to bring you the facts with, the entertainment of the story. I mean, we all enjoy a good story, okay? But the thing is, on this one, there was so much left out. It really blew my mind because I feel like there is so much more to this story that is left out that's so important. So let me take you all beyond the story now. This is my part from here on. This is what I figured out. So this is where I call beyond the story. So beyond the story, he said, you remember he went out that morning to get in his car to go get donuts, right? That's whenever he says he sees the creature, okay? The part they don't tell you is how he actually saw the creature and what the creature was doing, which I don't know why this didn't make it in the encounter because, man, this right here is freaky as hell, okay? So he goes out, gets in the car. He's in the garage, right? He's in the garage. Garage door's up, sitting in the car. He's fixing to leave. It's still dark. He's going to go get donuts for everybody. It's early morning, He's going to go do, something fun for the family. Looks in the rearview mirror. Now, he does see the creature. But what he doesn't tell you, or what they don't tell you in the original story, because they're trying to make a story, I think, this creature's not standing behind the car, guys, like you would expect to look in your rearview and see it. This creature is hanging upside down from the roof, looking at him, hanging into the garage door, which he said would have had to have made this creature over 7 foot tall. He noticed it had the size of about $half size eyes that were as black as coal. That's one of the first things that was left out of the story. I don't know why it was left out, but he later goes to describe what this creature looked like. And Keith says it looked like the god Anubis. It had more of a Doberman Pinscher's head, about from back of the head to the front of the snout, he said, about 20 inches. And he also says that the ears were erect and slightly laid back. And he estimated those to be between 8 and 10 inches to a point. This is a huge creature that is now hanging upside down like a bat. That looks like, a canine creature staring at you upside down. So that was one of the parts that was left out. So the symbols on the tire at the tire shop, I did find that he did take the tire to a college. They found a professor to try to get the wording deciphered. They was unable to do that as it didn't match any major known writings. But they said it could have been anything because back in those days there was a lot of smaller regions that had their own writing. So unfortunately, it was not able to be deciphered. I would have loved to have known what that would have said. Now, when they were talking about George, the guy at the tire shop, right? And then they start connecting George into this. I found this, and I thought this was pretty important too. That was left out of the story. Now, the officer, while Keith had spoke to this officer, the officer had mentioned that George had lived in the town for a very long time. Very few people knew him. But George also was rumored to have moved into this town, and they thought that he was from some part in Europe, maybe from Germany, they said. And he arrived in that town shortly after World War II, that he was supposed to have ties with a group from Germany that I can't say their name because we're not doing this on a members only, but you know who I'm talking about. And he allegedly had ties with those. Now, another thing that was left out and I thought was pretty important is the people in the town said George did not use the roads. He always used the railroad tracks. And whenever they started talking about the railroad tracks, there's a lot of stories out there where they talk about they believe these things may follow the power lines, they may follow the railroad tracks, easier ways to travel. But if you go back and you think about the Palmyra story that we just done and trying to connect these and to make a pattern, to make it make sense, you go back and you look at the Palmyra, you got the hooks, right, on the feet. We've talked about that. Now we have the hooked here, right, that are mentioned. Uh, Also, another thing that I think was pretty important, Palmyra, Maine, they went up on top of the house. This one was on top of the house, except for it was hanging upside down. At my granny's house, they were on top of the house, hung upside down, and knocked on her door. So there's three patterns right there, just that fast that we can throw out there. But another thing I think is pretty important too, and I will always believe this, is that Stephen King, being from Maine, knew about the werewolves, and the first unaliving that happens in the Stephen King book, The Silver Bullet, happens on the railroad tracks by a railroad worker. Just putting that out there. Now, later on, Keith was told that George, we said George had passed away. They had no trouble after that, but they don't tell you the specifics on George, right? We're going to dive into that. So I found out some pretty cool stuff. So Keith was told that George was killed along the railroad tracks. No cause of death, and no one has seen the body. Now, Keith did go back and try to investigate it, but here's the thing. There's no coroner's report, no death certificate, no proof that there was ever a service for him, right? So nobody knows what happened. Nobody has any idea. Now, whenever he went and spoke to the coroner, they said they have an old plot, an old cemetery. It's not even upkept. They don't keep records on it for people that pass away that do not have insurance, right? So it's probably buried out there, is what he's told. Nobody saw the body, no death certificate, no cause of death. All they know, there was a body found by the railroad tracks, and everybody just presumed it was George because George disappeared at the same time the body was found. Pretty strange. So Keith also was pretty intrigued about the prints he had found in his yard because it was during his snow. He said they were very skinny. They had a heel that was a little bit, odd. But the main thing was they were so skinny, about 14 inches, with the hook toenails on the end. We know that was also the case in Palmyra, Maine. So there you have a pattern with the tracks looking the same from Ohio to Maine now. So that gives us a little bit of a pattern on that. So Keith went and spoke to a Native American and told him about the tracks that he had found in the same town. The Native American told him that he believed that what he had seen was a skinwalker or a shapeshifter that became a dogman. He said that he had saw a pack of them in Wisconsin whenever he had visited up in Wisconsin. So, pretty interesting. We'll ask that question at the end. Well, let me know in the chat. Do you believe skinwalkers can transform into these canines? What do you think? Is there a transformation? Or are they always one? Are they always that way? Keith also had went around and had spoken to the people in town, and one of the guys in town said something had tore his back deck off of his house, totally removed the deck from his house, ripped it from his house. There ain't no man could do that. Something did. That man also told him there is bad things around here, and they're not human. But he didn't really want to talk about it. Now, Keith did say that whenever they first moved into that house, that he did feel watched. He felt like something was watching him. And the day that he felt like something was watching him was out in the back of their house by the wood line. They have one of those old metal sheds like you can buy at Atwood's or whatever. Said he was checking around it one day and he felt like something was watching him. But he did say there was a weird handprint on the back of the shed. A weird looking palm with very long, skinny fingers. 4 of them. So, Palmyra, Maine, we also remember that they said that they felt watched all the time. So, that was another thing that I thought was pretty important. Now, Diane, whenever we start talking about Diane, because I thought it was important to try to find out what Diane had actually seen, I found there was a lot that was left out on Diane that wasn't spoke about that I also felt like was very important. So, Diane, remember when she saw the eyes at the window? Well, they pretty much left it in the story that Diane saw these red eyes. Diane was afraid. She turned out the light. She thought it was a human. Well, there's actually more to that story. Uh, Diane stated that whenever she was at the window, she saw a large head with red eyes. But here's the thing they left out of the main story. She said it was a triangular shaped head like a dog, but it was way too big to be a dog. Now, that corroborates what Keith said about it hanging off the garage, over 20 inches from the snout to the back of the head. I would say they both saw the same thing. They're seeing a large canine creature. She's seeing it bipedal, he's seeing it upside down, but they're both describing the same size head. And if you remember Randy, when he used to talk about these creatures at his well, the first thing he would always say is how large their heads were. That seems to be a thing that's really brought up in these, is people do talk about how large the heads are on these creatures. So that may be something else to keep in mind whenever we start looking for attributes or something. Now, the daughter, I told you that was going to be very important, that was spoke about in the story just briefly, that was only 4 years old. I believe that she did do something that was very important to the story that was left out of the mainstream story. She would mimic to Keith and his wife the growling, dog sounding noise, and she would do this with her hand and point at the window. Keith believes that his daughter was hearing whatever was outside making that noise. I would take it a step further and say it was probably trying to communicate with his kid, because we know that these supernatural beings are interested in the children all the time. So, yeah, that child was probably in a lot of danger and didn't even know it. Now, Keith also said whenever they asked him what color was it, how did it look, he said that it had shiny black fur, it was short, but here's the thing, it had a short bushy tail. I thought that was pretty interesting, because there was a little girl in Oklahoma that I had covered that was bitten plumb over the shoulder down to her sternum and down on her back, right? And whenever she was like that, she described these dog-like creatures running off on their hind legs into the woods, and she said they had little short, bushy tails. So, what was she seeing? Was she seeing the same thing? I don't know. But there was something with a bushy tail. He also said that the eyes were black. There was no whites around the eyes, complete black eyes, like a shark eye. I think Shell mentioned that. Whenever they asked him how old George was, he said George was approximately 70 years old, probably knocking on 80 years old. But he was in very good shape to be that old. They said he didn't look that old at all. Another weird thing is it's a small town. Nobody had ever seen George in any of the stores. What was George eating? Where was he getting his food? So I started looking. London, Ohio has always had a high number of missing children that were always thought to have just been runaways. Just want to throw that out there for you. Nobody saw him in the stores getting any food, but they've always had a high population of missing children, runaways. Now, Keith, whenever he was interviewed later, said that he said that the eyes were not gold, that the eyes were silver. They were like the silver color, really mesmerizing that George had. One of the other channels that had interviewed him said gold. He said that wasn't true, that it was silver. They were trying to make a story out of it. Now, one of the things I find interesting is even though all this happened, Keith doesn't believe in werewolves and said he never called them werewolves, that was one of the stories that a place that he, or a channel he let interview him, he said they threw the werewolf in there. He said, I didn't throw the werewolf in there. If he would have called them anything, he said he would have called them dogmen, not werewolves. George, they said, was buried in an unmarked grave. So some people believe that if George was in fact the werewolf, was he buried in an unmarked grave, or was it time for George to have to move on because he got caught, and that's why nobody talks about where George is? In the room that they don't talk about in the story, which I think details are important whenever you tell stories, some of the details that was left out of that room are the scratches were not just on the walls. The scratches were all over the top of an 8-foot ceiling, too. The whole ceiling. George also did not own that cabin. They said George had been squatting in that cabin all that time. Inside of the house, there was no furniture, like we'd said, except for there was a table, like a kitchen table. There was about a 4-foot stick laying on the table that had X's carved all in it really nicely, like he was making a cane. Now, I found something pretty interesting too as I dove even deeper into this. This area in Ohio had something happen that was really, really, really crazy. The mayor's wife one night was driving. Okay, she's driving down the road, and she's headed to go see her mom. It's dark. She's going around the curve, and all of a sudden, something rips the back door off her car. Not opens it, rips the back door off of her car. They asked her if she seen anything, and she said there was a large black something standing on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. It was just a large dark figure. It ran up to her car and removed her back door completely. In the police report, the back door was found laying in the ditch. The police had no idea how it happened. She did. She said something ran up, grabbed it, and ripped it off. There was 4 large rips by the door handle, where something had grabbed that door handle and pulled that whole door off of that car. She sped up and got away. Thankfully, she sped up because I think that if it ripped the door off, it was coming for her. There was also another man in the area that Keith said in his interview that he had spoke to that also hit a large dark figure that whenever he hit it had ripped the whole front of his truck off, and it took off running. They never found any blood or anything else. So, Ohio, London, Ohio, you got something strange going on up there. There's something up there. This is too many things, especially the way all this goes together. I mean, this is crazy. Dana Ortega asked me to look into this, and I done the best I could, Dana. I dove deep. I found a lot of things I have not found that anybody else had discovered. I dug deep, and I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope everybody else enjoyed this one. What is in London, Ohio, guys? Is it a werewolf? Is it a dog man? Or is it people's imaginations? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Until the next investigation, guys, keep your heads on a swivel. Don't be something's dinner. We'll see you on the next one. And thank you for your support. I love you guys, and we'll see you on the next one.